right, welcome back to Jesus Lead, a podcast where we explore what it means to let Jesus lead in every area of our lives. I'm Melanie Schultz, and I'm here with Pastor Gene Johnson.
Hello.
And we're diving back into Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzero. And when Jesus is in the lead, he influences everything, including our emotional health and our spiritual well-being. So we're in chapter 3 today.
Chapter 3.
And as we're in chapter 3 today, we're going to be looking at how our past influences our present and how sometimes it can keep us stuck rather than propelling us into the future. And so breaking the power of the past, going back in order to go forward. That's what this chapter is all about. What are your first instincts, gut reactions?
My first is when I shared this with you earlier, and you were shocked by the fact that there's parts of this that doesn't necessarily resonate with me as much. I certainly, how about this? Like what you just said a moment ago, which is, the past certainly impacts our present and our future.
Yeah.
That resonates with me completely. Like I completely get that my family of origin, where I grew. I mean, how about this? I grew up here in Texas, right? You did not.
I did not.
So we even have a different, that different cultural aspect that's influenced my present. It'll always influence part of my future. So, history, when we've lived, where we've lived, those family origins, my past, my parents' past,
experiences,
my grandparents' past. Certainly, I totally get that
heavily
has an
influences.
impact. Influences and impacts my current reality and my reality going forward. As we get into we'll get into some of the conversation. We'll talk about the Geneagram, of which that's the piece that I'm like, I've done it a few times, and for me, it necessarily wasn't overly revealing. We'll tackle that. We'll talk about that later. But there are aspects of this that, again, it does resonate with me. I get it. I'm all in. Yeah.
Well, and one thing about Peter Scazzero is he appeals to the audience that has not been lifelong Christians. And so his story is one where he had a come to Jesus moment, and then later on he's like, I kind of had another one where I'm realizing that though I knew Jesus, I wasn't experiencing the fullness of what Jesus has to offer.
Yes.
Because I was still holding on to some of these pieces of my old life.
Yeah.
And for many of us, that resonates well. That there was a time before I was in relationship to Jesus, and now I'm in relationship to Jesus, and I'm reevaluating my life and taking stock.
Yeah.
For others of us that have been in the church from, baptism on, birth on,
right.
That prior life and new life in Jesus, there's not quite that stark contrast. Yeah. So I think that's what you were pointing out a little bit before we started.
Totally. And even using his story, right, of when he had that, Jesus finding him. I like to use. I'll use my theology a little bit better, but Jesus finding him, right? Yeah. That switch to him and how his past dictated not only his relationship with Jesus, but how he was going to function in ministry, and it wasn't healthy at all.
Right,
and that's what he discovered later on. Like Jesus found him, but he never really had that deep connection to Jesus, and his past was dictating, influencing his relationship with Jesus, as well as how he was going to do ministry. And it was all very unhealthy.
Even though he was
moment.
So even though he was compartmentalizing and kind of shoving his past away, he wasn't really even looking at his past history and how it might be influencing his relationship to Jesus. He just kind of said, the old has gone, the new has come, without really examining different areas of his life. That's one thing I really liked about this chapter is that we may think that we have a biblical worldview. We may think that we have the right perspective because we haven't fully examined whether what we're seeing and how we operate is something that's coming from our culture, our family of origin, messages we've received through media, maybe a particular denomination or spin or theology. And so this is pretty revealing, and I love the vulnerability again of Peter Scazzero as he goes in and he says, "Here's my story. Maybe it will help you to unlock some similar false beliefs or patterns or things that are keeping you from allowing Jesus to fully integrate into your life." So this breaking the power of the past, going back in order to go forward, I think we might have some initial worries and hesitations about going and examining our families under this light and, heading back a few generations. And yet the Bible really shows us that this is a true concept, that the mess, the sin of one generation trickles down and carries over into the third and the fourth. And so much the more beautiful is the promise that God's love and the love that he has for those who love him goes to 1,000 generations. So sin does have a say. It does trickle down. God's love is so much bigger. The Bible's very clear about that.
Yeah.
But not only do we get that picture of both the consequences of sin and the beauty of grace, but we also get tons of real examples of messy families and generational sin in Scripture.
Yes.
They go back to the patriarchs. They go back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What prime examples of family mess that just trickles down over and over again.
Yeah, and he points it out, like the similarities, the patterns, right? In there, the pattern of lying, the pattern of the favoritism. I didn't even think about that till he pointed that out. I was like, holy cow! Like
favoritism, generation after generation,
generation. You have this favoritism, and then the intimacy in marriages, and how much children out of wedlock, concubines, all these messy. Generation after just that pattern follows.
Unhealthy relationships. Yeah. And then how they affect the kids. Whether it's Abraham's unhealthy relationship with Sarah and Hagar, and then how that affects Ishmael and Isaac.
Yep.
Same thing with when you get down to Jacob and then his 2 wives and 2 concubines, and just the immense amount of jealousy and how that almost completely destroyed their family.
Sure.
And through the kids that they had. We see real pictures of messy families, and we see it in Scripture. We know that it's in our world too. What are the benefits of examining it? Because sometimes I think we're hesitant. We don't want to look at it. We may think it doesn't matter, but why might we feel bad about looking at our past? What might really get in the way of looking at our past? What do you think?
What might get in the way of looking at? Well, I mean, most of us, and even going back to using these biblical examples and now moving them into a more contemporary place. Some of the patterns, and he points it out in here, but patterns that I've seen as a pastor in generations of families in a more modern setting. I mean, you have addictions that you can see. Going back 3-4 generations back, that these patterns of addictions that continue to follow, and they're ugly. And generally, and I'm just using addiction as one specific pattern, but you can have abuse, like violence and abuse, that is a pattern that'll follow. And so it's ugly. And so who wants to spend time looking at that ugliness?
Yeah.
It's easier to sweep it under the rug, not acknowledge that there are realities in my family's life that are now a part of my life as well, that I don't necessarily want to have to deal with.
Yeah. And I think for another perspective, I don't want to dishonor my family, my parents, my, ancestors by suggesting that their grievances have affected me, so there can be some hesitation or some guilt even in saying, yeah, my relationship with my parents was this way, and that has had an impact on me. And I can understand the heart behind that. But Peter goes so far as to say that when you continue to sweep it under the rug, when you continue to bottle it up, God can't heal it. And this doesn't mean you go broadcasting everybody's dirty laundry all over town.
Of course.
And that's not what we're suggesting.
Nope.
But when you refuse to examine it, when you refuse to weigh it, to acknowledge it.
How about put the elephant out on the table and put it in front of you so you can deal with it?
So you can deal with it, right? Not so that the whole world gets to judge it, but so that you can deal with it.
There's a level of honesty, as going back to earlier, thinking about, I was listening to you talk, that there's a level of honesty that has to be there in ourselves in order, right, to put this thing out on the table.
Yeah.
Recognize it, confess it, it's real.
Yep.
And now what do I do with it? How do I deal with it? How do I get this past and move forward from this thing from the past?
Yep. And it takes a lot. Scazzero says it takes the intervention of God himself and intentional biblical discipleship to break the patterns that are so deeply embedded in our sinful DNA.
Yep.
And so the first step into that intervention is that we need to face it. Sometimes people will not face the reality of the baggage that they carry emotionally, whether it be from trauma, from family situations, from their culture, whatever it might be. People often don't face it until a crisis puts them at a breaking point. And so that's one of the illustrations we get in this chapter is Peter has a conversation with one of his congregation members, a man named Frank, who is a pastor. Yeah, so he's a friend who's a pastor. And he just comes to him and he says, like, my marriage is ending and I don't get it and I don't understand. And the more he talks, the more he just kind of reveals and unravels these pieces. And what it really took was him hitting a wall in his marriage and having the listening ear of someone like Scazzero for him to start to unpack and face that this problem wasn't something that could be compartmentalized as just between him and his wife. It was patterns that each himself and his spouse were bringing in from previous generations and past experiences and trauma and that had led them to this point. And so once you have all that information, once you're able to recognize all sides of the elephant that's on the table, that's when you can really start to deal with it. But until then, it's the hint of something. It's something that you can't quite grasp. So that was a key piece here. So, you might say, why do I need to dig up the past? Well, it's going to come out one way or the other. It's going to try to confront you. And so you can be a bit proactive by examining this, in some time, or maybe you are in a crisis and you're like, I think this is the time I need to start examining it. But really getting all the pieces out on the table will help you to grasp what's going on. Because otherwise you'll feel a bit like Frank, who says, I don't have a clue where this is coming from. I don't understand it.
That's what I was thinking about earlier as well, is some of these crisis moments are revealing to us something we're not even aware of.
Yeah.
And so, the going back and just reviewing life and moments of life and the history and all can actually help reveal things. Some of the elephants that I keep talking about putting out on the table can reveal those things that I'm not even aware of. And so I appreciate what you just said. One, I may not even be aware of this pattern.
Right.
That's either a part of my family history or maybe it's just a pattern that's part of me. I'm not even aware of it. And so me reviewing and becoming more aware of it helps me put it in front of me. Now, reviewing it, like what I said, what I appreciate you just said is then now being able to look at it from all the different angles. What is this thing? Why is it here? What do I do with it?
Yeah.
I'm in a better position to deal with it in a very healthy way.
Right. You can't deal with something you don't see, something you don't understand or grasp the depth of. And so one of the things that we'll talk about toward the end of this chapter is doing this in community. That having this process of examining, reflecting, getting additional perspective is something that we need to do in community. So that's part of the reason this podcast is doing this book, is because we need community to be able to examine emotional and spiritual health and what the Word has to say about it, and being kind of a bit of a mirror for each other at times.
Yep. And we talked about this, and make sure you pick the right people.
Oh yes,
that you do that with.
yeah.
There's a trust piece there. You don't just grab someone off the street to say, "Hey, can
Bingo.
you help me evaluate this thing?" Yeah.
Yeah. So at the very end of the chapter, he talks about doing this in community, finding a mature friend, a spiritual leader, a trusted mentor, a therapist, a counselor.
Yep.
So people that know what they're doing, people that are biblically focused, that do know Jesus, and that are going to be honest and helpful to you, not just, brutally critical. So I love where this chapter starts, that it's like, we understand it's hard to look at your past. There are reasons why you might not want to dig it up. There are reasons why you might not recognize some of the things that have happened in your life and the ways that they're still influencing your behavior and your thought patterns right now. But he gives us several different ways to look at our past, some strategies. And so one of the strategies is to think about your family of origin, your culture, the way you grew up, the way you were raised, and start to recognize the unspoken rules and expectations that have been hardwired into your brain. They have a list on page 78. That's a great starting point in terms of categories. He calls them the 10 commandments of your family. And the 10 categories that he lists are money. So how does your family think about money? What are the unwritten rules? Conflict. How does your family of origin deal with conflict? Sex, grief and loss, expressing anger, family, relationships, attitudes toward different cultures. The idea of success, how do you deal with feelings and emotions? So those are 10 categories. You could add more to that, certainly.
Sure, you can flip and flop. And
but I thought that those were great starting points, because certainly whether it was spoken or unspoken, you probably grew up with some sort of rule, expectation about each of these categories. Like I think about feelings and emotions, and it's easy to see how some people very clearly know how to share and express their feelings and emotions. And other people, it is the most foreign thing to them. It feels wrong. It feels like they're not allowed to. So, certainly your family of origin has a big influence on whether you know how to categorize your feelings, whether you feel as though you're allowed to express them, and how they can come out. Which of these stands out to you?
So the success.
Okay.
For whatever reason, I can look back in my family history, and it wasn't necessarily like, oh, you got to get into the right school, or you even got to go to school. It wasn't any of those things. It wasn't even about money either. It was about titles. Like having the right, says something about you, and that others will look up to, and it makes the family proud. They're able to,
so they can say, my son or daughter is such and such title. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what I guess for me, even personally, I can say I look at my own personal history.
Yeah.
And some of the earthquakes, we'll talk about that, but that it became a big part of my own DNA and culture, was chasing after those,
markers
labels
of success.
That would, that family members would be like, oh, he's made it, or that, which is silly to think about now, but I mean, that's the one that just jumped out at me. Yep, that was us.
Yeah. And again, this is subtle or overt messages that we may have received. And it may be something that was a mantra said over and over again in your family, or something that you just internalized from one experience. And it was an impactful experience, and it just shifted or changed the way that you viewed one of these topics or some other topics there. I think about conflict. How does your family handle conflict? I never, ever saw my parents fight.
Really?
Never.
Yeah.
And so when I got into relationships in college and things, I remember early in marriage, we got into a fight about a grocery list. And I thought our marriage was over.
Done. The conflict, because there's
there was no conflict. And so any conflict was just like terrible
That's the end
sign.
of the thing. Yeah.
So I avoided it at all costs. And boy, does that cause some internal stress and added tension, and will really catch people off guard when it finally comes out. So yeah, each of these categories I would highly recommend. So we don't really give homework in this podcast, but this is a good place to start.
But going back, I mean, how about just using my example of the success piece and your example of the conflict piece?
Yeah.
What we're talking about here, what's coming out is the recognition.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So now when conflict does happen, you're in a more healthy position to deal with conflict.
Yes, because
rather than freak out and think this is the end of the world.
Right.
Conflict happens. It's actually normal.
Yep.
I recognize it's not been a part of my past, and so I'm approaching it now from a different place.
Right.
But now you're able to grow into that. Same thing with me, with the whole success piece. Recognizing that, I'm able to recognize my own inner desires to chase after those things, thinking that's approval. But me knowing that, actually now it helps me to realize they don't mean anything.
Yep.
It's okay. I don't have to be anything special to anyone else or seek approval. It just helps me. Yeah.
You have a better view and a better way to handle stuff as it comes your way.
Yep.
And that's the goal. That's the goal with all of this. You know, if you grew up thinking money is the be all end all, and you're recognizing, oh my goodness, that was the message, and maybe it wasn't an outright striving or greed, but just a desperation because money was always tight growing up. And so now it's become this idol in your life. Once you can recognize it, once the elephant's out on the table, you're able to examine where it came from and maybe stop feeding it, then you can deal with it, right? You can start to put the right size priority onto that issue, work through it thoughtfully and biblically. So I really appreciated that as a strategy, as a tactic for unpacking some of your own history. And this is probably not a single session sit down and you can figure out all of your emotional baggage.
Goodness, no.
No. So you might go, I don't really know I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Maybe this is something to revisit in a week or so. And did anything else pop up that came to mind? Again, that'll be with each of these strategies that we talk about in today's episode. So these 10 commandments, that's one strategy for kind of examining your past.
Yep.
The next one is a big one. It's a genogram. So think genetics and gram, obviously a picture. So a picture of your genetics. Really what you're doing is you're making a cute little family tree.
It is. No, that's great.
It truly is. There's an example on page 85 of a family tree that includes Peter, his parents and siblings, and then his parents' parents, so his grandparents. So he's looking at 3 generations, 4 if you count his own kids, but 3 generations, and some of their critical pieces of emotional baggage or struggles, potential traumas, things that had a heavy emotional impact, and then how some of those things he can recognize patterns or potential places of influence. I feel really kind of proud of myself for this little bit of knowledge. Correlation and causation are not the same thing, right? So if you see patterns, it doesn't mean that one caused the other.
Correct.
But it is important to note that if you see a couple things that seem to be showing up in a few places, it's not necessarily saying one caused the other, but it's good to note. So, for example, the vulnerability, I so appreciate. He goes back to the relationship between the grandparents on his mother's side, and he acknowledges that there was abuse, that there was just an absolute lack of trust and intimacy, and he's able, through probably a lot of time and thought and reflection, to put some markers on the personality, the temperament of his mother, Frances, and how she related to her situation in light of the abuse and the abandonment and the struggles that she had as a child. And then in turn, he's able to recognize how her parenting led to some of his own patterns. So I want to just share one example.
Yeah, go ahead.
So,
go, please.
Peter's grandfather, his mother's father, was abusive.
Mm-hmm. You want to say his name?
Crescenzo.
Okay,
that's what I would say.
Well, that's pretty good. Yeah.
He was unfaithful to his wife, abusive both to his daughter and his wife, and potentially some of the other children in the family. Peter's mother then, she became detached, depressed, and had sort of a take care of me attitude, which she brought into her marriage to Peter's father. As a result, Peter grows up with a fear of abandonment because of a detached mother who's depressed, and has a strong sense of a need to take care of others and work because his mother has been very dependent on both him and his father to take care of her needs.
Yep.
So even in just 2 generations, grandparent and parent, we can see the impact of the hurt and the way that he internalized messages about his purpose, his role, maybe even about family, about his own worth and value and what he brings to the table. So much could be packed up in here. But it took him to a crisis point in his marriage to really explore this.
Yeah.
This wasn't something as a 7-year-old, like, oh yeah, I take care of my mom because she was abused. No. Like, this is something that he had to really think about, research, and unpack. But in doing this, he found immense freedom to say, oh, well, yeah, work and caring for others, those are godly things, but overwork and guilt and shame-driven need to take care of others is not. So he was able to put the elephant on the table, examine it from all angles, and then balance it, not let it continue to rule him and push him in directions that were not healthy, but to say, okay, here's the line. Here's an appropriate boundary where this is good and healthy, but that over there is not. I found that to be an incredible tool. And again, this is a piece of homework that's going to take some time and quite a bit of paper.
Yeah, a lot of paper. The ones that I've done been really gigantic.
Big pieces of paper.
Gigantic pieces of paper. So here, the full disclosure, because we've talked about this, like, for me, this was like looking at his is it's a lot of work.
Yes.
Okay. And I've done a couple of these geneograms in my past. And they've been semi-helpful, but not overly helpful. That's me, okay? I'm only speaking for me. But here's part of the realization is, again, as you pointed out, it takes a lot of work. And you're going to have to have the opportunity to know some of your family history.
True.
And so for some, it means digging, doing some digging, and you may not even be able to do some of that digging.
Yeah.
Of which, that's kind of, I think, the case for me when I look back. It was easy for me to go back one, but once you get into the second generation, for me, the information's not there. It starts to become very muddied. And so there's not a lot of clarity there. I can look at my mom's, side and my dad's, his parents and her parents, and I can get a little bit of a picture. But beyond that, it's totally muddy.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to find some of those patterns. And so for me, again, that was semi-helpful.
Semi-helpful, yeah.
But
a tool to use.
A tool.
Right.
Correct.
Maybe not the be-all, end-all, and that's okay.
Yep.
I found some things to be very helpful, but the most helpful thing has been conversations with my mom.
Correct.
And, she's very self-aware, and she has a real empathy for other people. And so her ability to look at her own mom and recognize, her relationship to her mom and kind of put herself in her mom's shoes and things, or her dad's shoes, she has an awareness of that prior generation that really has helped me to identify some patterns. My mom has shared a sense of her dad's gentleness and her mom's strictness and kind of where those things came from. She was able to recognize that her dad, my grandfather, always got in trouble as a kid. And it wasn't go sit in the corner, time out. It was a time when there was some serious, strict punishments, whether in the classroom or in the home. And so he carried a lot of shame.
Yep.
But
I'm not good enough.
I'm not good enough. I'm
bad.
I'm bad. And he was determined to break that pattern with his kids.
Yeah.
And so he became a very gentle father.
How about that?
Whereas my grandmother, I know she came from a very strict family, but she seemed to carry more of that strictness into the relationship with her kids. And so when you broke a rule, you knew it. And so my mother was able to kind of tell me and share with me her knowledge of that history, which, then I can see the pieces of my mom and the pieces, of her parents as they, as that's trickled down to me. And I can see in my mother fear of not being good enough and messing up, that she's getting from her dad and less from her mother, who is more strict. And so, but yeah, the conversations with people, if you have that ability, which I know not everybody does, but if you have the ability to talk to family members and relatives to get some of this information, that could be really beautiful.
I agree that is that's part of the work that it takes to do this is it means intentionally sitting down and digging with some of these family members if you have
the
that opportunity.
Even siblings, having conversation with siblings can reveal some of those things, because I'm a younger sibling. I have 5 siblings, 4 are older and 1 is younger. And so their memories, my older siblings, their memories of things, they've got stuff on relatives that I'm like, I don't think I ever saw them more than twice.
Correct.
But yes, so this genogram can be extremely helpful. It's a tool, not the be-all, end-all, but can help you to assess patterns in relationships. And the next one is simply noting what kind of baggage you carry. And I think this comes from probably your favorite piece of advice on breaking the power of the past and going back to go forward, which is just the significant life moments that you've had. So significant moments in your life that if you could go back, you could kind of pinpoint, this is where this became an issue for me. This is where this became vital for me. This is where I got this sense of identity is here.
Yep.
So would you share a little bit more about that?
He calls them the earthquake moments. And I think I've talked about this before. For me, it's life turns. What I call them, and that's coming out of Donald Miller and Man's Search for Meaning, the great book. But yeah, life turns.
Okay.
And so life turns are, I think I've talked about this here before, but life turns are moments in your life that you look back on, and it's this, and he uses the earthquake moment, but and I think that's fair, in which everything going forward is never going to be the same. Like there's a huge change, and there's positive life turns and there's negative life turns.
Yeah.
And the reality, what's funny is that Joseph, right, the biblical story of Joseph in the book of Genesis is this wonderful story of life turns.
Yes.
Okay, of positives and negatives.
Yes.
Because this is what we see the pattern in the story of Joseph. And it's kind of the same thing in our own lives. Generally, a negative life turn is you usually don't have like 2 or 3 negative life turns or 2 or 3 positive life turns that show up,
back to back.
Back to back. Usually it's kind of this up down pattern.
Right.
But it's the negative life turns that kind of have the most significance though for shaping part of our DNA and our how we will emotionally react going forward. So how about using the, in my family's 10 commandments of success, right? I go back to that one because it was a pattern within my family. And one of my negative life turns, which happened when I was about 5 years old, believe it or not. But how about this? I did not discover this until I was well into my 30s and 40s.
Okay.
Right?
So that's what we're getting into this chapter, right? Taking the time to look at your past so that you can pinpoint maybe where these life turns are. Are you willing to share?
Yeah. Okay. So I was working through these life turns. So part of the work when it comes to life terms, different from Geneagram, is you're only examining your own life.
Okay.
And you're going back and you're specifically noting those moments again when this thing happened and life going forward was never the same. And you try and go back as far as you can, right, to your childhood. Because there's always going to be significant moments in your childhood that you don't even think about, but they were significant. And so for me, the one, again, I was actually probably about 3 or 4 years old when this moment began, which you're not even aware of. I've never even shared this with you.
Okay, I'm excited.
But no. But no, I'll try and keep it somewhat brief, but my pituitary gland, okay, so your pituitary gland, which is growth hormone, right, stopped working. So I imagine a 3-year-old, right,
who stops
fingernails aren't growing, hair's not growing, and it took a while for parents to recognize, like, hadn't had to cut his fingernails in 6 months, hadn't had to get a haircut, all these things. And taking you to the doctor didn't know what to do, send you to specialists, and to finally discover by the time I was 4 or 5, so a long period of time had that my pituitary gland wasn't working.
Yeah.
And so it started this whole long process from my life of, Texas Children's Hospital became part of my life, testing and doctors and experimental drugs and everything to get the pituitary gland to start producing growth hormone. So, anyways, I had this moment where, okay, I stopped growing, but my peers didn't, right? And so by the time I was 7 years old, I look like I'm a 3-year-old. I'm a 4-year-old. Can you imagine that? Being in the 2nd grade, right?
Yeah.
I remember, I don't remember, but my parents, my mom telling me, like, they weren't going to allow me to go from kindergarten to 1st grade, like, because of I was so physically far behind, even though mentally I was fine. So imagine the impact that has on you as you're growing up. Now, when I was very little, I didn't think anything of it until I started getting a little bit older, right?
Yeah.
But then it becomes very evident, like, I'm half the size of everyone else. Well, in the midst of this, I had a family moment that was of great impact. And it was when I was, I think it was probably about 7 years old. So I put all this earthquake moment together, of which my entire family, big family, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone, and I fall right in the middle from an age perspective. I'm right in the middle, or maybe even just on the other side of the upper middle. But they're all going on this huge trip. Guys are all going to go out hunting. Girls are going to go do shopping, but they were going to leave the littles behind. So guess who got left behind? Yeah. So I got left behind with the babysitter, along with the 2 youngest girls, right? And there were kids who were younger than me that went on that trip. And no one at that time, it had a little bit of impact on me. I remember when they all came home, realizing what I'd missed. And then as I grew, realizing why I missed it, why I was left out. And so anyways, long story, but what that did was ended up having such an impact on me as I grew up into, middle school, high school, college, beyond, that I chased after titles and recognition because that moment I was left behind. It told me I was worthless.
Yeah,
like
you were unseen.
I was unseen. I was not recognized. I was not valued. All of these things. And I can't remember exact moment, but there was a moment probably in my 20s with my family. We were gathered around, and for whatever reason, that's the moment that surfaced in my head, and I lost it. And everybody couldn't figure out what was why I was having such an emotional breakdown. And then I shared it with my parents and my siblings, and it just crushed them.
Yeah.
Because it was a reality for not only for me, but for them as well, that moment was so impactful that it changed the way that I viewed and chased after everything from that moment forward. Was recognition. I wanted to be seen.
And I so appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that, because it wasn't as though it was something that you knew all along and were dragging and using as an excuse. Not one bit. I think sometimes we think, well, I can't let my past, I'm not going to give my past the right to have power over me. I'm not going to acknowledge it. No, it was acknowledging it that allowed you to move through it.
Sure.
Because you had been carrying it, not intentionally, but unintentionally. You hadn't had the opportunity to take a look at it, to see it from all angles, and then allow the decision of, how is this going to influence me? It just was.
Well, and here's what's really, again, this moment for me, I told you, like I said, I had this emotional breakdown.
Yeah.
I don't know, when I was in my 20s, and I have no idea why it surfaced. I can't remember what the conversation was, but it surfaced, I had a breakdown.
Yeah.
And my parents and all were freaking out, like, what is happening?
Yeah.
And I didn't even know until I started talking about it in that moment, and we all realized this was this crushing moment. But however, I want to be clear, like in my 20s when I had this emotional breakdown, it was this moment surfacing, but I didn't deal with it for a decade later. Like when it wasn't until I started doing my life plan, these earthquakes, that I realized how significant that moment was, and it impacted all these other life turns. And even where I was in the moment, because like I said, chasing after success and titles and recognition, I didn't recognize that was a part of my whole process until I did the life plan, until I actually did the work of recognizing that.
Wow. Okay, so what are we learning from this? We're learning that you can be completely oblivious to the things that you are, have from your past, the things that you're carrying with you, the things that are influencing your behavior and your thought patterns and your expectations. You can be oblivious to it. You might know it's significant, but not know how or why. And you might know how and why it's significant, but still not deal with it. So what we're talking about in this emotionally healthy spirituality is looking back, naming it for what it is, assessing it, and dealing with it, which is a big process.
Yeah, and not
a quick one.
No, and I don't want to. And again, I think my example is a great example, and I'm going to continue to talk through it here, so that everybody has a full understanding. That so the emotional breakdown in 20. Also imagine I didn't know what to do with it. I was able to recognize that I had this thing, but guess what that did? It totally had a huge negative impact on my relationships with my entire family from that moment going forward. Man. Because I realized in my 20s
you were able to name the hurt.
All of these people who are significant people in my life, family, people that I love, left me behind, abandoned me back then. And so when I had this emotional breakdown, part of my emotional immaturity in that moment also became anger and hatred toward all of those people who did this thing to me. And now, again, then I did the life plans, and I realized, okay, now that's when I actually dealt with it.
Yeah.
Became emotionally mature.
Right.
Through that process, and actually found forgiveness, for this thing that happened to me long ago, of which they never it wasn't intentional, but those really, little things that if you recognize them and you're able to work through it,
you won't end up stuck.
No, it brings so much clarity and freedom.
Yes. Like Peter Scazzero says a similar thing. He says, when I look back on so many areas of my life where I've now done the work, I'm just sad and disappointed that, there was so much needless pain.
Yeah.
The stuff that I carried for so long before I dealt with it, you know, and it makes me think of the different stages of grief. You can't rush them. But really, like when you endure a significant change, or a significant event, you're gonna have that stages of grief. And sometimes we get stuck in one. And we don't let ourselves explore, what might come next. Certainly grief is fluid and, natural parts, and they can last different seasons and things. But, when I think about you were able to recognize, right? You weren't in denial about the situation when you were a child.
No.
And you no longer were necessarily even sad about it. You moved into anger and then got stuck there.
Yep.
That I think can happen too. As you're dealing with this, as you're looking back at the past, we might be tempted to say, woe is me, or to get into a position where we're just dwelling and despairing or being furious in the things that have happened from our past and the things that maybe have happened to us or the things that we've done. That's not what emotionally healthy spirituality is either, is being stuck in that. But it's, again, putting it on the table, examining it, acknowledging it, and then with God's help and direction, processing, moving through it, right? Taking the pieces with you that you need to take with you and leaving the things behind that you need to leave behind.
Yeah.
So this is a messy process. This is not a not a clean cut,
discipleship
easy
is a
thing.
messy process,
and it's a process. Absolutely. I think about it's funny. We're quite the pair. Because where your pituitary gland stopped working, I moved to a new school in the 5th grade and was 6 inches taller than everybody in the class.
Not an easy thing.
No, and I was the only girl.
Yeah.
So that was a huge struggle for me, and definitely also stayed in that recognition of this is a painful moment in my life, and allowed it to rule me instead of dealing with it and moving through it. So for a long time, I dealt immaturely with the hurt that I had. And I was able to recognize, like, moving in 5th grade and being the only girl in the class was the worst time. I was able to name it. I knew what it was. But I didn't fully recognize how it was influencing my relationships, how it was causing me to not feel like I could fit in with other women, to try to be so tough because I felt like I had to be, that then I just wasn't really myself.
Right.
So I was wearing a mask.
Yep.
So yeah, I have a similar, although slightly different experience of just, that sense of not fitting in, of being singled out for reasons I didn't want to be singled out. And then, feeling like I had to prove myself in certain ways. So I would imagine that's a very common thread in people's worlds, that you've had those moments where you have felt either left out or singled out in a way that was not okay with you. And so again, maybe that's an area where you just spend some time with the Lord and you say, Lord, can you reveal to me some of the ways that influenced me, so that I can really start to assess, what's good that I can take from it and what's stuff that I need to let go.
Yep.
So noting the baggage that you carry, I'll say it again, Peter's transparency is just wonderful. His ability to lead from weakness, as one of the things that he shares is something that happens as you mature in spirituality. He says he was able to find 5 habits and areas and patterns that were based on his past experience and that were not founded on Christ's good design. And those 5 areas for Peter were over-functioning, just doing too much. It was out of necessity or a feeling of necessity in his youth. And then over-performance, having to kind of compensate for others and be seen. That was another area that really heavily influenced him in a negative way and was pushing him outside of Christ's design. He also recognizes his unbiblical expectations for marriage and family. I thought that was really, really good, because I think for so many people, relationships and our expectations are where we get into trouble, because we have these unspoken yet very strong expectations.
Sure.
And then, obviously people are never going to meet all of your expectations. And so when they don't, then figuring out how to navigate that, and was my expectation realistic? Was it communicated well? Is it fair? Any of those things. So he talks about his unbiblical expectations for his marriage. And then he also says he had poor conflict resolution skills, and he didn't let himself feel. So he really struggled. And when you don't let yourself feel, you often don't let other people feel either, because you don't know what to do with it. Did any of that stand out to you?
The poor conflict resolution, not not that it sticks out to me from a personal perspective. I think that's across the board. That's a part of most of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one that stood out the most.
Yeah, he says, even though I taught workshops on peacemaking and conflict resolution,
right. But actually doing it and living in that true positive reconciliation and conflict resolution.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he also has a really great relatable way of talking about the way that his culture influenced this as much as his family. So his family of origin is Italian American. And so he says, like, yeah, well, Italian family's this, it's just, this was kind of the norm, and not to overly simplify or stereotype, but he recognizes the places in which his culture also influenced things beyond just his family, and then also not in biblical ways. So he talks about the picture of all women in our extended family complained about their husbands. So when his wife complained about him, he just thought it was normal. Silly, the interactions potentially, the joking, but she wasn't. And so just some of those, again, those pieces where it might take an outside perspective, or it might take stepping outside to try to look at it from a 30,000-foot view to identify some of the things, like, is that really biblical? Is that cultural? Is that normal? How do other people perceive this expectation that I'm holding? All right. So do any of these areas strike a chord with you? Do you see some of your potential baggage in the things that Peter did, whether it be being overworked or feeling a strong sense of a need to perform, poor conflict resolution we discussed, and not letting yourself feel? Maybe those of you listening are saying, yeah, that one definitely ticks the box here. Or maybe it's saying, yeah, that's something that potentially, or I can recognize that in my family. Good. Take note of those things.
Exactly. Examine it.
Yep. Examine it. As we move forward, one more tool for evaluating the past and seeing how your family or the way that you grew up is influencing you currently, he provides the Beaver system model.
And just as a joke, I mean, seriously, when I read this, I was like, is this like the Beavers?
Leave it
like,
to Beaver?
Are there
yeah,
Beavers
yeah.
that have is there a system for how Beavers live? And then I realized, no, this is just a theoretical.
Yes, yeah. It's
a family systems theory.
Yes,
yeah.
and if it helps to think about, leave it to Beaver, go for it.
Well,
I don't know.
I was picturing beavers. Like, did they study beavers for?
Oh man, yeah. I don't know.
No.
There's a little note we could probably look it up in the back.
It's like it's like a family systems theory type model. Yeah.
So there are 5 levels in this model. Level 5 is the lowest, and it goes up to level 1. And each of the 5 levels explores a family's ability to maintain healthy boundaries and to function well together. Level 5 is described as the family in pain. This is a family that has leadership that is lacking. It's full of chaos, confusion, uncertainty.
Right, a lot of abuse.
Yes, potentially abuse or absence. Just the completely unsettled conflicts are never fully dealt with or resolved. And you really can't even look at things with clarity because of how chaotic the scene is.
Yeah.
So that would be the extreme, the low end. And this might be your family, or this might be your family of origin. I know that, as I was being trained for foster and adoption, we talked a lot about family of origin and bio families and things like that, and how when Department of Protective Services comes in, a lot of what they're trying to do is meet these families where they are and help move them into a healthier spot, so that
moving
they can,
them from level 5 to level
up
2
to 2s, and but yeah, a lot of that absence or conflict resolution and the inability and the chaos, right? Some of that chaos that may not be relational chaos, might just be situational, circumstantial chaos. I think about people who, like, for example, Uma, who had absolute chaos growing up. His family unit wasn't necessarily the problem, but He was living in war-torn countries.
The culture he was living in.
And
Absolutely.
so this could be situational as well, where your family's in pain due to whatever
due
circumstances.
to the context of where they're living.
Level 4, so moving up slightly, is called a borderline family. They're polarized. Polarized, it's kind of a fancy word, meaning you got people on one extreme and the other. Kind of at odds with each other. Instead of anarchy, where there's complete chaos, in a level 5, you maybe have one authority figure against everybody else.
Yeah.
Or opposing dictators trying to, win the struggle over potentially the children or other people living in the house.
And it's an environment where, as he says in here, is like you can't disagree. Like you can't voice your
It is black and white.
Your opinion. It's very black and white, very rigid.
You step out of line, here's the consequence.
Yeah. There's no questioning.
Yeah. So in that, the very tense, almost antagonistic between the two parties, or where there's a hierarchy and then the absolute submissive. So that's a borderline family. Level 3 is a rule-bound family. There's not particular chaos, nor is it a dictatorship. It's a bit healthier, but your feelings of importance and value and being loved is dependent on your ability to contribute or give what's expected, so there's this kind of underlying guilt and pressure that permeates.
If you love me, you do these things.
Yes. Okay. So there's like kind of this manipulation that's happening. And unfortunately, I think this is where a lot of us have, seen this in our families, have had seasons of this. Maybe this is our go-to, where, we want our kids to feel loved, but maybe our go-to as parents is the threats of consequences. And so then the kids really don't feel secure in their relationship, right? So level 3, that's rule-bound family. That's what that is. Level 2 is called the adequate family. And in this family, there is a sense of cherishing and valuing the members. They can be flexible. There's a bit more order and routine. They do value a sense of closeness. There's some trust, some teamwork. Parents are, enabling the kids to be successful. But what lacks and what distinguishes level 2 from level 1 is the word delight. Delight, where families truly enjoy each other, cherish each other, want to spend time together. And so obviously that's the optimal. That's level 1. That's where we want to be. That's God's design.
It's incredibly healthy.
Yeah. Where there's order and routine, but there's not guilt and shame.
Right.
There's cherishing and
there's
contribution.
There's authenticity, there's vulnerability, there's genuine love and care and support for one another.
And there's the ability to be unique, right? Not that you're loved if you're shoved into this pigeonhole.
No. Right.
And so the tool that Peter Scazzero shares with us here is, what was your family of origin? How would you rank the level using this Beaver system model? And then a good exercise too is, where's your current family situation at?
Right.
And an honest evaluation of that will probably reveal that you're maybe somewhere between 2 and 3 different categories, and that's okay. But starting to say, ooh, yeah, I wonder if my rule-bound tendencies are causing my kids to feel consistent guilt in my home, or I wonder if that's why I'm operating with so much fear, is because I grew up in a home that felt that way to me. So again, a lot of unpacking that can happen can give you clarity for moving forward. And that's the goal, clarity moving forward, and ability to manage things. The chapter wraps up with Joseph, which is my all-time favorite Old Testament
I gotta be honest with you, it's one of my favorites as well.
So much there.
And for me, again, it goes back to Life Plan, because it follows, his story follows that pattern.
Absolutely. Up and down, and it's wild. If anybody had a reason to be angry at God for an unfair life and angry at their family for the mess they were in, it's Joseph.
Yes.
But Scazzero gives us this outline of why Joseph was able to look at his past, face it, and move forward in a healthy way. He didn't stuff it. He didn't dwell in it, but he was able to put the elephant on the table, or several in this case,
just
and
listening to how you
examine
say that, and I'm going to use a word but he never played the victim.
it.
Like, he never saw himself as, woe is me, I'm the victim.
Right.
He faced the challenges head on.
Yeah.
Understanding his past.
Yes. And here's the pattern that we can take with us as we examine our past. Joseph, number one, he had a profound sense of the bigness of God. So when he looked at his situation, he knew and he believed God can take whatever situation I'm in, and he can and will, he promises to use it to his glory. And so he didn't, in spite of all the stuff that came his way.
Yeah. The way that I liken that is to Ken Blanchard, Lead Like Jesus, one of the other great resources that I always turn to. From a leadership perspective, in which Joseph, at times he was he a leader?
Yeah.
And in fact, most of the instances, even in his low moments, he was still an influential figure.
Yeah.
And a leader. Part of his leadership was he had a God-grounded competence. So when we talk about recognize the bigness of God, it was Joseph had a God-grounded confidence that no matter what the circumstances, God is present, God is in control, and God is going to use this moment for himself.
Yeah.
And I'm going to rest and trust in him.
Yeah, and the promise that we see several times written in these few chapters in Genesis is God was with Joseph,
him.
right?
Yep.
God was with Joseph.
God was with him.
But the second piece, so he recognizes that God is big, and yet he admits honestly the sadness and the losses of his family. So we see that he, upon hearing about his brothers, he weeps. He has to leave the room. He cries so loudly that people in the next room can hear him. And he wrestles with seeing his family again. And so that's, he is able to recognize it. But he also asks God to be the guiding lens on what it is, because he could stay very angry. He had within his power and within his rights to crush them.
Yep.
And yet he said, "I see God at work to bless."
Yep. What you did was evil, but God's going to use it for his glory.
And that's the attitude and the posture that's going to bless us too, is to be able to look at our past and look at the mess and say, other people may have meant what happened to me for evil. Even my mistakes, are not pretty or not good, but God has the power to work it together for good despite all human interactions.
Yeah.
And third, Joseph rewrote his life script according to Scripture. So again, he didn't play the victim. He didn't say, woe is me. I mean, can you imagine being in prison for years?
No.
And how many times would you just be like, I will, my whole life has been a mistake. I will never trust anyone ever again.
Yeah.
It's God who put me here, or I'm just going to stuff my feelings because it's too painful to face reality. He could have done any of those things that we would tend to do. And yet he didn't. He was determined to believe God would do what he said he would do. He was determined to show that, God is faithful. God is on the throne. God is with me. And so, it makes me think, and Peter shares this too, of who doesn't know someone who was hurt in a church and vowed, I will never trust any spiritual leader or church again.
Yeah.
Thankfully, Joseph didn't have that attitude. That's an attitude that isn't going to serve us well.
Right.
So he wrote his life script according to Scripture. And finally, he partnered with God to be a blessing. Wow. I mean, is there any more powerful story that we see in this world than somebody who has the right to be angry and hurt, but chooses instead to turn into bless? I mean, that's the tearjerker moments that, that you see that in the world. And that's God's whole story for humanity.
I was just going to say, that's Jesus.
That's the gospel.
Yep.
Yeah. He has every right to turn, to crush, to walk away.
Not doing it.
Yeah, I'm not doing it. Get thrown in the towel. Forget it. It's not worth it.
Right.
And yet he partners and he blesses. So that's what we want to be able to do with the pain and the hurt in our past, the brokenness, the mess in our past, is to partner with God to allow him to claim and transform that, and then to move forward and allow it to be a blessing.
Yeah, they're going back to man's search for meaning. So this is what sometimes when I'm meeting with folks who have dealt with a trauma or a negative life turn, it's called the redemptive perspective.
Yes, yeah.
And so the redemptive perspective is being able to look and using mine as an example as well. Like this moment that happened. That yes, we could get angry, curse
it's terrible.
God,
it's not good. Yeah,
all that. And instead look at it and go, okay, how is God going to use this? That's the redemptive perspective.
Right.
And Joseph had that redemptive perspective. And I've certainly walked with families who've dealt with a trauma or an earthquake, moment, and trying to wrestle through that redemptive perspective of how is God going to redeem this to use it in a, and the thing is, and it may not be for 40, 50 years down the road.
You may not see it. Yeah, it might not be really visible in the moment. Yeah.
But being able to discover that brings with it peace and freedom as well.
Absolutely. So that's kind of how we hope to model facing the brokenness, the mess of our past, and not stuffing it, compartmentalizing it, shoving it under the rug, but also not dwelling in it, but to, again, put it on the table, acknowledge it from all sides, and then prayerfully, thoughtfully invite God into it to help us to navigate. Hey, this is the reality of the brokenness and the hurt. This is something that I can take from it and that is true. And this is maybe stuff that's just not helpful or not true that I've been operating as though it is. And so I need to put that to the side, and Lord, help me do that. So that's our prayer for you as you examine this chapter and as you begin maybe this process or re-enter this process of facing the past in order to go forward. And next week, we get to journey straight into a wall. Doesn't that sound like fun?
It does. Totally ready for that.
Because really that's kind of what we end up against sometimes is just we get to a point where like, this is that turning point, or this is a moment in which things can't go back to the way they were. Things need to be different moving forward. So I'm very excited about the next chapter. I certainly hope you all will join us next time. Pastor Gene, would you close us in prayer?
Yeah, let's do that. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you for this conversation and the ongoing conversations. Thank you for your undeserved grace that has showered us with new life. Because of Jesus, we've been taken from death to life and given life. And Lord, it's not a life that is promised that everything's going to go perfectly. We're going to experience all kind of difficulties and challenges throughout our life, and give us, Lord, the opportunity to be able to see those challenges, to be able to look back on the previous challenges of our lives, and to be able to see with great clarity how you're using them to help shape and mold us into who you've created and called us to be as followers of Jesus. I pray that you'd bless those who are listening today, and bless us as your children and as followers of Jesus, and everything that we think and everything that we do is being led by him. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. We'll see you next time.